I hadn't met George before today, but I'd read a bunch of his writings, which really impressed me. And so I thought I'd invite him here. George lived all over the place. I think he currently lives in Montana, but he's lived back in Vermont. He's lived in Eugene. He just picked up his daughters in Eugene, and they didn't want to come hear Dad speak, so they're off in a hotel somewhere at the moment. But he's got experience like you wouldn't believe out there. He travels, he's a photographer, he leads tours. He has 250,000 images, I think, that he sells a bunch of them to things like Audubon Magazine and U.S. News and World Report and all sorts of different publications. He's won a bunch of awards. He has degrees in botany and wildlife biology and liberal arts. He's attended graduate schools in Montana State, at University of California and University of Oregon. So he's got a lot of experience, and if you read his writings, it really shows. So in addition to photography and writing, he also teaches field ecology classes. He guides natural history wilderness tours, and he was telling me that he works on a bunch of policy-related things for deep ecology, I think you're saying.
Foundation for Deep Ecology.
Yeah, Foundation for Deep Ecology, providing a whole lot of background information on a lot of really interesting subjects. So anyway, I just thought, we really got to get this expertise here. So I mean, I thought people would really enjoy it. So without further ado, let me just introduce George.
Okay. So thanks. I appreciate the invitation. And Peter's going to press the buttons on this. And
we want the lights off?
Yes, I would like them off if you don't mind, or at least a lot of them up here off. Okay, great. And what I'm going to try to talk about, or Peter asked me to talk about, is I think probably a lot of you are aware of the health effects of eating a lot of meat products and dairy products and so forth. But there's also ecological impacts that go on that are probably less well known and more subtle. So this is to tell you about those kinds of impacts, the ecological impacts, which is what I know about the best. And a lot of my focus here is I'm going to be talking about public lands, because I put this program together. This is a new version of it, but it's still, I try to make it so that it's applicable to other groups, and I talk a lot about public lands. But anything I say about public lands would be just as true of livestock on private lands, so keep that in mind. All right, so the real cost of livestock production, and I want to emphasize this one point, livestock production. What you'll hear a lot of people talk about is livestock grazing. But there's more to producing livestock than just grazing. For example, if you are running livestock in a lot of parts of the West, you might shoot coyotes and wolves. Well, that's a cost of livestock production. It has nothing to do with the grazing of the grass, okay? But that's still a cost, an ecological cost. So let's go through this. And like I said, this is the first time I'm showing this particular version. So this is the point I'm trying to make, is that livestock production is more than grazing. It includes everything from irrigated hayfields to predator control. And this is something too, particularly the irrigated hayfields. People they just are blind to it. You'll go down the Willamette Valley, for example, to Eugene. You'll pass all these hayfields. And what are they growing the hay for? To feed cows, primarily. And the amount of land that's under irrigation, primarily for livestock food. And I'll use these words interchangeably. And I want to tell you a little nuance. Livestock can include things like pigs and chickens and so forth, but the bulk of the cropland used in this country that produces feed for livestock is producing it for cattle. So I often say cows or cattle and livestock interchangeably, but it's a subset of this livestock in general. But most of the irrigated hayfields are feeding cows, dairy cows or beef cows. You know, not chickens or pigs or whatever. So that's a good example.
Is that a wolf?
That's a coyote in eastern Oregon, hanging on a fence. Okay, to scare all the other coyotes, right? Anyway, livestock production comprises 70% of all the agricultural land use and 30% of the surface area of the planet. So if we're talking about an impact from humans, there is virtually nothing else that has a bigger single, thing that you can identify than livestock production. It is the big thing out there, and it's the elephant in the room that nobody talks about. Next. So what contributes more to global warming, for example? Is it your automobile? or is it the cattle? Next picture, it's actually the cattle. According to the United Nations, animal agriculture contributes more to greenhouse gases than transportation. You know, this is shocking to most people. They don't even give it a thought. Next picture. And you have lots of things, for example, loss of biodiversity. This is a picture I took in Hawaii of cattle. This was tropical, you know, rainforest in Hawaii that's been cleared to make cattle pastures. And of course, you know, you have the same thing happening in the Amazon and Africa and lots of other places where you have very high biodiversity, and converting those lands into livestock production, to me, is like the most insane waste of biodiversity you can think of, you know. Next picture. Another argument you'll hear a lot of times from pro-cattle producers is that cattle are just replacing bison. But there's real ecological differences. It's sort of like saying you can take a black bear and replace a polar bear. I mean, they have different evolutionary histories, and they're not the same animal. And just for example, some of the differences: bisons move more often. They spend less time in riparian areas. Riparian areas are the green, wet areas along streams. They're very important ecologically. And so cattle spend a lot of time there and do a lot of damage. They're able to defend against predators, so you don't have to go out and shoot wolves and coyotes, for example. And they can survive on feed that they can get themselves, whereas most cattle, at least in northern climates, like if you were in Montana with snow and stuff, have to be fed hay because they can't forage enough and get enough energy just grazing. Next picture. So I'm going to try to get you to think about some of these things that you go by all the time and probably take for granted, like hay fields. This is an ecological cost of livestock production. Next picture. Trampled riparian areas. Again, the riparian areas are these the green areas along streams. This might look pretty to a lot of you because it's green, but this is a very, very degraded area. The normal on livestock impacted stream would be very narrow and deep, and would have lots of shrubs and grasses growing along, not just an inch high grass. You know, the grass might be this high, and so this has been severely degraded. But it's so common, and it is so widespread that we take it as a norm. And the analogy I like to use is like going to Los Angeles and never seeing the stars because there's so much smog, and you just think there's no stars up there. Well, because that becomes your normalized thing. Well, we've done the same thing with the streams around the West. We take that as being the norm. Next picture. Another impact is a lot of places they spray poisons out there to benefit livestock production. For example, sagebrush is often sprayed with herbicides to get rid of it. That's an ecological cost of livestock. It has nothing to do with grazing directly, but is another impact. Next picture. Of course, trapping of predators is a very common thing. We have a government agency, Wildlife Animal Services, that goes out and actually traps coyotes, wolves, mountain lions, and all that for the benefit of livestock producers. Which, by the way, I can't even remember because it was a couple of weeks ago I put this together, but most of these conflicts can be prevented, but they cost the livestock producer more money. In other words, there are ways, even if you wanted to run livestock, which I don't think is a good idea, but if you did, you can do it in ways that minimize the conflict with, for example, with predators. Next picture. Another thing, prairie dogs are killed as pests all through the West. There used to be billions of prairie dogs, billions of prairie dogs. There was one prairie dog town in Texas that was documented to be several hundred miles across. And now, you're lucky if you can find a prairie dog town in the West. The biggest ones are like 5,000 acres. And there's very few that are any larger than that. So all these prairie dogs have been killed, and there's all sorts of wildlife that depends on prairie dogs, from burrowing owls to black-footed ferret, which are an endangered species because they feed on prairie dogs. Next picture. And yet, many environmental organizations promote livestock production, citing what they call the condos versus cows. And the condo versus cows thing is, well, if we get rid of the cows, then we're going to have condos everywhere. And I think that's a false argument. I'll tell you why in a little bit as I get through this. But I just wanted to set this up so you're thinking about this, because you'll hear this all the time. Though I get it from a lot of people that agree with my points about the ecological costs, but they say, but, you know, if we get rid of the cows, then it's going to be a lot worse because there's going to be houses everywhere. Well, that's a bogus argument, and I'll show you why. This is another one of these. This has to do with Oregon. So I've made a few things for Oregon here. This was an article that was in High Country News in 1999, and the manager of this White Horse Ranch, which is one of the bigger ranches in eastern Oregon, grazes a lot on public lands, said a lot of this environmental stuff is bullshit. Every time you turn around, you hear ranchers are ruining everything. I certainly don't think we are ruining anything. And the hardest part is having environmental people, that's like me, with no clue what they're talking about, come out here and tell us everything we're doing is wrong. Granted, there were mistakes made in the past. You'll hear this all the time. Certainly there was overgrazing from time to time. But like any business, you either get smarter or you don't go anywhere. Okay, this is in 1999. I took this picture in 2001. I don't know what I'm talking about. This is the White Horse Butte allotment in eastern Oregon, and this is badly degraded rangelands that is being managed by this guy who tells me I don't know what I'm talking about. So, next picture. The ecological footprint of livestock production affects more than 1 billion acres of the 1.9 billion acres in the United States, excluding Alaska. So, more than half of the United States is affected by livestock production. That includes acres of rangeland grazed, you know, like eastern Oregon, rangelands grazed. Then you have 120 million acres of pasture grazed by livestock. To give you a perspective, Oregon is about 60 million acres. So figure 2 Oregons, nothing but pasture being grazed by livestock. More than 250 million acres of croplands growing livestock feed crops, primarily used for livestock. For example, feeder corn, soybean, and hay. So if you put all those feeder corn together, soybeans, and only like 1% of soybeans goes to feeding, you know, making tofu and stuff, you know. Most of it is going to livestock feed, and that's being consumed by livestock. So all those croplands, when you drive across the middle part of the country, or you fly over, as they say, the flyover zone of Iowa and places like that, and you just see nothing but cornfields for miles and miles and miles from one border to the other, most of that's going to feed cows. And some pigs and some chickens, but mostly cows. So just think about the statistics. Next picture. 306 million of those acres are public lands. Okay, so out of that whole, you know, billion acres I'm talking about a third of them are public lands that we have some control over. Next picture. And that's equal to the entire East Coast, from Maine to Florida, with Missouri thrown in. So if you put it the acreage, the total acreage of all these states here, and then threw in Missouri, that's how much 306 million acres is. That's a lot of land. That's our public land that's being grazed by livestock. And BLM land? BLM and Forest Service land, and then there are some other, like wildlife refuges I'll talk about, that are grazed by livestock. So if you put all that together, and some state lands, you get 306 million acres. And the thing about it that's pretty shocking when you think about it is how much land that is. That's our public land. It's basically everything that can be grazed. In other words, you're not grazing up here much on the Mount Hood National Forest because it's so heavily covered with trees. But if there was any place on there where there wasn't trees, at least in the past, in recent past, it was probably grazed by livestock, and just about any place that is possible is. And most of that shouldn't be. Next picture. So this gives you an idea. This is the BLM lands and the Forest Service lands that are grazed here. And you can see it's mostly the drier part of the west. So, you know, the Cascades here aren't grazed, and some other forested areas. But it's mostly the drier parts of the west. And this has problems, next picture, because aridity really limits what you can do. That's one of the problems. When people that are livestock proponents say, well, we can fix all these things, you can't fix it because it doesn't make economic sense to do it. If you were to try to graze livestock in a way that didn't do this to the landscape, it would be ungodly costly. It wouldn't be cost effective. It wouldn't make any sense to do it, even with all the subsidies that agriculture gets. This is BLM land out in eastern Oregon. Next picture. So just giving you some examples. So that's BLM land. Here's Forest Service land. Next picture. I'm just kind of showing you different public lands. Another Forest Service picture. Next picture. Wildlife refuge. You can see all the wildlife out here on the boundary of the refuge sign. Next picture.
How can they put cows on the wildlife? Yeah.
Well, you know, I mean, they got cows, though, that's the point. You know, any place that can be grazed just about gets grazed. You know, even some national park areas are grazed by livestock. So here's another, you know, boundary of the wildlife refuge. Next picture. And here we have a pretty well-known national park that happens to have cows in it. There's lots of places with cows that are shocking to people to learn about. Next picture. So, and even some of you may know wilderness areas are supposed to be places that are managed primarily for natural processes and features. And this is an Fish and Wildlife Service wilderness area being managed for natural processes, these natural animals out here. And you know the irony, you'll hear all these agencies talk about how we have to get rid of exotic species. And they're talking about weeds and stuff like that. But you know, this is a pretty exotic animal here. It's not native to North America. So next picture. But they never talk about getting rid of them. And then even a lot of the environmental groups don't seem to notice or are unwilling to admit that livestock have a bad effect. And one of the worst is the Nature Conservancy. And they own a bunch of ranches around the West where they graze livestock. And their argument is, well, we have to get along with the ranchers, and so we can't, you know, we got to be buddies with them and do the same thing. You know, that's the kind of logic of it. But there's a lot of damage being done. So this is a ranch in Idaho operated by the Nature Conservancy. This has rare plants right here. I used to work for the BLM as a rare plant botanist in Idaho. And that's several rare species right there, and it's just trashed on the Nature Conservancy side. That's not conserving much nature. Next picture. Here's another one, Dugout Ranch. They have a big feature about the ranch owner, Heidi Reed, and you can see a video on their website about how she's really loves the land and everything like that. Well, this is her ranch right here. It's just trash. It's owned by the Nature Conservancy now, but they allow her to run her cows still there. Next picture. And by the way, there's a proposal to expand Canyonlands National Park. This is right next to Canyonlands National Park. And the Nature Conservancy is opposing the expansion of the national park because if it got expanded, they would kick the cows off of the BLM land that Heidi grazes on. So they don't want to do that because poor Heidi then wouldn't be able to ride her horse around and be a cowgirl. This is our largest area that has intact wildlife populations where you will find the most elk, the most deer, the most bighorn sheep in the lower 48 states. And yet, except for a few places like Yellowstone Park, most of Grand Teton, with a few exceptions, and some of the really high country here, the green is on-grazed land. And the red is private land that's grazed, the yellow is public land that's grazed. And this is the premier wildlife place we have in the country. And yet it's dominated by livestock production in the best place. Next picture. So, livestock production is the most pervasive land use in the West. Approximately 525 million public and private acres in the 11 western states are grazed by domestic livestock. That's 70% of all land, or just about every acre that could potentially be grazed in the West. And to give you another perspective, 525 million acres. Okay, the state of California is a little over 100 million acres. So we're talking about more than 5 Californias, which is the third biggest state in the whole nation, you know. We're talking about a lot of land that's affected. Next picture. And croplands occupy 455 million acres, or 24% of the U.S. Most of this cropland, as I said, grows cow food, not human food. And this is one of the really, you said, I've over the years done a lot of research on agriculture, and you'd be shocked on how little land it takes to grow vegetables and fruits. I mean, it's, you know, like all the strawberries in the whole U.S. are grown on 10,000 acres or something like that. I'm just making up a figure off the top of my head. But it's, when you start looking at the actual acreage for various fruits and vegetables and so forth, it's a really small amount of land. California, which grows half of our fruits and vegetables in the country, half of them, if you look at the acreage for fruits and vegetables, it's a little over 3 million acres. And yet most of California is used for growing cattle and cattle feed of the agricultural lands there. 3 million acres is not very much land. It's, you know, when that's considering that's half of the fruits and vegetables for the whole country. So, next picture. So, by comparison, and this is where I get back to the condos and cows kind of thing, comparison, all the developed land in the entire U.S. occupies about 60 million acres. You'll see different versions of this figure because it depends upon how they figure it up. But I'm using the larger figure, but that's about 3% of the United States. That's all the factories, all the roads, all the highways, all the subdivisions, and so forth, is about 3%. Not saying that's a good thing, but when you compare it to livestock production, which is worse? I'll tell you, in my view, as obviously you can tell. Next picture. So this is a picture showing the urbanized areas. This is the red to make them show up, because they actually be harder to show up. But you can see there's Denver, Salt Lake City, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, LA, and so forth. But look at how much isn't urbanized. And most of this, particularly in the West, is grazed by livestock, or it's growing feed like hay or something for livestock. Next picture. So here's land use in California, the most urbanized state in the West. Yellow is the urbanized land. This is if you were to look at all the land in California. So this is where San Diego and San Francisco and Fresno and Sacramento, this is how much of California is occupied by it. And this is the ag land here, private ag land. Private ag land, most of which is growing livestock feed. And then you have a lot of the federal land. And I could never get the percentage of what percentage of California federal land is grazed, but a lot of it is. So you can see what the impact is there. Next picture. This is a map, and these are crude. These are old slides that I took and then made into digitalized. Okay, but this was what's called a gap analysis. And the gap analysis, what they do is they use aerial photographs of an area, and they have a computer go through and digitize the different land uses based on 30 foot square pixels. In other words, a house or this building shows up in those photos, okay? And that shows up as an urban area. So they're very, very precise. In the state of Montana, where I live now, 5.14% of the state is used just for irrigated haylands. So over 5% of the state is just irrigated haylands, all of which is used for feeding cattle. Next picture. Here's the urbanized stuff in Montana. And these are cities like Missoula and Butte and Great Falls and Billings and Bozeman and so forth. But it's 0.17% of the state. And then, you know, I hear this condos and cows thing all the time. And I'm just talking about hayfields. There's just no comparison even between that. And then if you talk about lands that are grazed and so forth, then we get a much larger figure. So next picture. And you can see this impact. This is an air photo showing the border between Alberta and Montana. And these are all fields. Now, a lot of this is wheat fields. But it's just to show you the impact of agriculture is so huge that you can see it from space. Next picture. And ag crops, you know, they fragment wildlife habitat and so forth, and you can see the stuff from the air. I mean, if you go fly down the Willamette Valley, frankly, a lot of that is agricultural land that's, you know, and a lot of it's growing cow feed, hay and grass. Next picture. Which is sad because the Willamette Valley is probably one of the most productive places. You could probably feed half the country on the Willamette Valley if it were growing vegetables and fruits. This just shows some percentages of cropland, U.S. cropland. Soybeans are 28%, corn is 30%, just to kind of give you the percentages of various other crops. And again, most of that gets fed to livestock. Next picture. So when people say, we're going to starve to death, if people couldn't grow, you know, steak or something like that, you know, like, oh, we're going to feed Africa. Yeah, we're going to send steak over to Africa, you know. Meanwhile, we're going to take all this corn and we're going to funnel it through a cow, which is very inefficient. Then we're going to try to sell some poor Africans some steak they can't afford, and that's how we're going to save the world from starvation. If you want to save the world from starvation, you'd be using all this great agricultural land for growing food directly for human consumption, not funneling it through a cow. Next picture. 90 million acres in corn. To give you a concept, Montana is 93 million acres. So we have, if you can imagine, all of Montana from one border to the other, just nothing but a cornfield. That's how much land we have in corn. Next picture. Full accounting needed. Most livestock proponents focus on a few aspects of livestock grazing, such as overgrazing of grasses. This is relatively easy to correct, but in the arid West, raising livestock without significant impacts is impossible. A full accounting is necessary. And I get this all the time. You know, they tweak the grazing this way or that way, and maybe they don't graze it as frequently or as long or something like that. But that's just only part of the impacts. Again, this is your riparian zone here that's totally trash. The stream is wide. It's not narrow. The banks are being trampled and falling down. There's hardly any, the grass is only that high, like a golf course. Next picture. But a lot of livestock proponents would say that's a good thing. So the West is an arid place, and aridity limits what you can do and magnifies the ecological costs. And this is down in California in the desert, in Mojave National Preserve, by the way, Park Service area, another national park area that's being grazed by livestock. And you know, these are just like the absolutely insane. You know, if you came from another planet and you said, we're going to try to grow cows in the desert, a water-loving animal that was evolved in northern Europe in woodlands, and we're going to put it out in the desert, I mean, you know, you'd be saying this is insane. Yet most of the areas being grazed, particularly the public lands, are very dry areas. Next picture. And one of the things that happens is overgrazing is not just a one-time event. It's the continual cropping of grasses. And what happens is the grasses, when they get cropped, they go, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. I'm losing my photosynthetic material. I have to feed myself. How do I feed myself? I feed myself with the green things that are above ground. So then it grows new grass shoots, but it does so at the expense of its roots, because it translocates energy from the roots up to the grass, because that's still the most important thing. But then what happens, if that happens repeatedly, the root system gets shorter and shorter, and then you have a drought comes along, and then the plant dies. And it wasn't because the drought directly, it was because its root system was compromised by constantly being cropped. Next picture. And wild cattle of evolution of moist woodlands, by nature cows gravitate to water, like this picture here. And those riparian areas where 70% of the wildlife in the West depend on these riparian, 70-80% actually, depends on where you are, but 70-80% depend on these wet areas. So any impact of that has a disproportionate effect on all the wildlife, even though these riparian areas only make up less than 1% of the western landscape. So if you have an animal that spends an inordinate amount of time there and it does damage while it's there, then you're having a disproportionate impact. And this is one of the impacts that's a result of aridity. So you got, you know, cows, if you're in Vermont where I've been living, cows do a lot of damage there too, by the way, despite Vermont's promotion of dairy. But the cows there don't necessarily spend all their time in the creek bottoms because it's lush everywhere. Okay, but you go out to eastern Oregon, the only place that's lush is right along the creek. So they gravitate to those creeks. Next picture. And there's a lot of impact. So this is the wrong animal in the wrong place. It's an animal that's adapted to moist woodlands, and we're having them in the arid West. Next picture.
Where did cows originally come from?
Well, there's two kinds, two evolutionary stocks. One is from India, that area, and then the others are Northern Europe, wild cattle from up there. The ones that are most of the cow that you would see in the West are from Northern Europe. So here's a cow in a riparian area on the Chalice National Forest. And most people would look at this and say, oh, that looks like a nice spot. But again, it looks like a golf course. That grass should be this high. Now let's say you're a sage grouse and you're trying to hide from a hawk or something like that. Is there a place for you to hide here? If you're a trout and you're trying to, and you've got to have cold water, and there's the willows are all gone along the creek because the cattle have been trampling on and eating them for a long time. Now the temperature's warmer so that you can't you know, survive there, or if you do, there's fewer of you and so forth. So those are the impacts. Next picture. And this is another cow trash riparian area. Next picture. I'm going to give you a whole bunch to make the point here. Here's another one here in the Wasatch National Forest in Utah. Again, see how the banks are trampled, and there's just some relic willows left. Next picture. Here's another one. This is Red Rock Valley in Montana. Again, this is what it ought to look like. This is what it looks like. You're a vole trying to hide from a coyote or something like that. Which side of the fence you think you want to be on? Next picture. Here's a arroyo cutting. One of the effects of all this is when the vegetation gets eliminated, the riparian vegetation, this riparian vegetation at one time probably the stream was up here, then there's nothing to hold the banks together. So every time you have a flash flood, it tears up the banks, and then you get this what's called down cutting or arroyo cutting, so that the surface of the water level goes down, and then even if you wanted to reestablish, say, willows up here, they can't get their roots down far enough to touch the water. So once you start this process, it's very hard to reverse. Next picture. And this is in Barry Reiswick, who used to be the refuge manager of Hart Mountain Wildlife Refuge here in Oregon and Sheldon Wildlife Refuge in Nevada. And Barry and I were walking around. This is on the Sheldon Refuge in Nevada. And he has historical references that talk about how there was a wet meadow here. And so this is the down cutting, you see. And so he said that he talked to one of the ranchers that grazes this wildlife refuge, by the way. He said, yeah, we used to go across here and our horses used to get stuck in all the wet mud. And Barry had a dry sense of humor. He said, yeah, we sure fixed that problem. And but as we were walking back, we're walking through this sagebrush, and he tripped on this log. This is a beaver cut aspen. So at one time, there had to be a beaver pond here and aspen growing here. That's how much it's changed to a sagebrush, total sagebrush environment from a wet meadow with aspen. Next picture. Probably, 50, 70 years ago. And what you will see around a lot of parts of the West, what I call historic cottonwood trees. You'll still sometimes see some big relic trees or relic willows and so forth, but they're not being replaced because all the young ones keep getting cropped by the cattle grazing out there. Next picture. And then here's another one showing how, again, we normalize degraded areas. Most people look at this and say, what a beautiful trout stream. Okay? But notice you can see that it's not very deep, so it's kind of wide. You can see the bank is sloughing off here. You can see there's no willows, it's just, grass along here. And I'm standing here at this fence, taking a picture out this way. I turn around 180 degrees and face the other way. Here's the same creek. See how wide it is? And as soon as it crosses this fence that hasn't been grazed in 100 years, it gets a lot narrower. Next picture. And then, here it is, going through. See how narrow it is? And we have willows and stuff. And then this is the creek right here. The same creek that was this wide is now this wide and about 3 feet deep. In fact, I was wandering around out here looking for the creek, and I came walking along here and I fell in right up to my knees and thigh in the water. Almost broke my leg, because you couldn't even see where the creek was anymore. It's just this little thing right here, telltale sign where the grass covers it over. Now, again, you're a trout. Which is going to be a better habitat? This nice, narrow stream that's deep, where predators can't get you, where it's going to be cool and shady, or the other one? Where's a better place for stopping floods? If high water comes through here, you've got all this vegetation that slows down the erosive force of the stream. So all around the West, we've destroyed the ability of these streams to absorb floods. Next picture. Here's another one. Here's looking upstream, grazed riparian area. You can see there's cottonwood, historic cottonwood trees, but there's no young ones. I turn around at the fence, and I go downstream, and it's been closed off for 5 years, and you can see all the young cottonwood trees and willows growing there, and you can see the stream is already starting to narrow. This is the exact same spot. Just all I'm doing is I'm shooting this way upstream, and I'm turning and I'm going like that downstream. That's the difference. Next picture. This is a shocking one. This is the San Pedro River, BLM area. They kicked off the cows. This is what it looked like. I was standing on a bridge. These are not my pictures. These are from the BLM. But this is what it looked like 11 years later from the same bridge. That's the difference. 11 years without cows. And this is in Arizona, where there's a long growing season. So you wouldn't necessarily see that kind of a change in someplace, a more northern climate like Montana. But it does show you what the potential of these places are and what they look like with the cattle and what they could look like. Now, your songbird, you want to nest? Where's the nesting better, here or here? Your fish, where's a better place for fish habitat, here or here? I mean, all these things are affected by the livestock. Next picture. So that's why we have so many endangered species around the West. A lot of the endangered species are connected to livestock production. Next picture. So nesting birds are affected. Next picture. This is all riparian dependent. And this is a list of endangered species in Arizona due to livestock production. So we got fish, we've got amphibians, we've got reptiles, we've got all sorts of birds, and it goes on to the next page on mammals and so forth. But so it's all sorts of groups. It's not just, you know, things you would normally associate. For example, bats. Bats in Arizona, the red bat, uses big old conwood trees, like I showed you in that earlier picture with the real rough bark. They roost under those conwood trees. Well, because those conwood trees are disappearing and they're not getting replaced, the red bat is endangered because it's losing its habitat, which is the conwood trees that are big and old and have rough bark. So who would associate bats being affected by cows? Not normally, but that's what the problem is. Next picture. So, getting back to this condos and cows thing, and I don't want to sound like I'm promoting subdivision, because I'm not, but there's still this assumption that it's always worse, and it's not always worse. Here's a picture of the same stream. This is going through the subdivision. This is where it's grazed by cows. Again, with what we're talking about, which is better wildlife habitat? This part in the subdivision or this part with the cows? Next picture. This shows you the difference. Here's the road going through. See, there's the subdivision, there's the other stream. Like night and day. Well, if I'm a wildlife advocate, I'll take the subdivision over the cows. It'd be better if we had neither. Okay, that's the thing. But necessarily, this is not necessarily the worst thing that could happen to the landscape compared to what cows do. Next picture. And then there's agriculture is exempt from the Clean Water Act. And you know what cows do. Every cow defecates about 100 pounds of waste a day. And the average person, I think, is 1 or 2 pounds. So imagine if you have, you know, doing a comparison, I did some calculations for the state of Vermont, which is in love with dairy cows. And Vermont has something, the equivalent of waste is produced by cows in the state. It would be, the population would have to be 10 million people. Now, that 10 million people's worth of waste just being spread on pastures right next to creeks and streams and all that, we would never allow that to happen here. But, you know, for people to do that, but we let cows do that with complete freedom because they're exempt from the Clean Water Act. Next picture. And so you get, you know, the water pollution in the creeks and streams. Next picture. So that's another uncounted cost. Water use. Now, this is another one of these deceptive things. People assume that domestic water use, such as drinking and or things like swimming pools, use the bulk of Western water. Media articles spread this myth. So you see it all the time. You know, LA is running out of water. It's going to tap the desert or something like that. Well, the fact is that most of the water in California, next picture, actually goes to growing cattle feed. And we have all this kind of stuff where water is diverted out of streams for, this is an irrigation ditch here on the Big Hole River in Montana where there's the endangered Montana grayling. And the grayling is endangered because it needs water. And it doesn't have enough because most of the water goes into things like irrigation. Next picture. So, a lot of the dams in the West that are built, they're built for various reasons. They're always justified for a whole host of reasons because that's how you get through Congress. But the majority of them are built for irrigation water storage. And then secondarily, they'll have hydropower. In fact, the hydropower helps to pay for the irrigation water because most of the irrigators pay a very subsidized rate for the water that is subsidized by the power consumption of urban consumers, basically. So, for example, the cost of this dam is paid for by the electricity that's generated so that it can store water for irrigators. And next picture. And that's very common. Then you have groundwater pumping. So you're storing the surface water and you're building dams, and that has all sorts of effects on everything from salmon and so forth. But groundwater pumping too. This is Bruno Hot Springs in 1920s, and there's a unique snail. See, this is the kind of thing people don't worry about. They say, so what, snail? But anyway, there's a snail called the Bruno Hot Spring snail, and the only place it's found in the world is in these hot springs. Well, so this is what it looked like in the 1920s. This is the exact same spot here in the 1990s. So the snail is going extinct. Are you surprised? And that's because they're sucking the water out of the ground, and they're using it to irrigate hay pastures on the plateau above for cows. And again, it's an uncounted cost. Next picture. And 90% of the water in the West goes to irrigation to grow cow forage. And that includes crops like corn, but also hay and irrigated pasture and so forth. And this gets skewed. The more rural a state is, the more skewed it is towards irrigation. So in Montana, where I'm living now, 97.5% of all the water in the state is going for irrigation for primarily hay and pasture. You get to a state like California, you got a bigger urban population. It's more skewed, a little bit more skewed towards urban, but still mostly towards agriculture. Next picture. So here's another one. This is a flood irrigated field next to the Stillwater National Wildlife Refuge in Nevada that I photographed. I'm literally standing at the fence line here, right over here, that says, "Welcome to Stillwater National Wildlife Refuge." This is right next door with subsidized irrigation project, our federal tax dollars, subsidizing this flood irrigation, and here's the wildlife refuge dried up because all the water got diverted to grow hay. Right there, right next door. So, next picture. And when you go, and this in Montana, I have this whole condos and cow debate all the time. This is the Gallatin Valley where Bozeman is. So I'm flying into Bozeman, and you look down, and you can see there's a house there, and you see a couple houses there, and so forth. But what do you see mostly? You mostly see hay fields, as far as the eye can see. Next picture. So here's Colorado's use. Irrigation goes for 85%, public water supply 4%. So that's, and most of that is growing cow food. Next picture. Nevada. Even with all the sprinklers in Las Vegas and so forth, and the fountains and so forth, it's mostly irrigation. And Nevada hardly has any cows. That's the irony. This is an aside, but I remember there was that the big, what was it? Well, I guess it was 9/11. And tourism went way down in Las Vegas because nobody was flying. And they said this one hotel had to lay off people. And it was like 38,000 people were laid off or something in Las Vegas that worked at just one of these casinos. And in the whole agricultural section of Nevada, there's like 2,000 employees, you know? And yet, what does all the water go to? You know, it goes to this one little section that's hardly, you know, a blip on the economic scale. Go ahead. And so here's an irrigated hayfield in Nevada, where all that water is going. Next picture. In the desert, by the way, where you have high evaporation rates. So you have to use way more water to grow the same amount of grass as you would someplace else. Here's California. Even with all the urban populations, 11% public water, 83% for irrigation. Next picture. And this is the two primary crops, irrigated pasture, alfalfa, hay. The two biggest water users in the state of California of that stuff, of that 80-some%. Next picture. So that's why things like the bony-tailed chub, which is in the Colorado River, which is an endangered species because we have dams on the Colorado River to provide irrigation water so that they can grow, you know, hay fields in the Imperial Valley in California in the middle of the desert. Next picture. And spawning salmon, you know, in places like the Pacific Northwest with all the dams here, that the salmon are blocked or affected because they can't go downstream at the same rate they used to go because the reservoirs slow their migration to the sea, and then the dams block their upstream migrations and affect it that way, even with fish ladders. Next picture. Loss of wetlands, because you're diverting water. So like the Klamath wetlands down in Klamath Lake, Oregon, are like 50% of the size they used to be because they drained a lot of the wetlands to make hay pastures for cows. Next picture. So we have things like the spotted frog, which is a Columbia spotted frog, which is, I don't know if it's on the endangered species list yet or being proposed. But anyway, because you're draining all these wetlands and springs and so forth, things like the frog are becoming endangered. Next picture. And I make these points of frogs and snails and stuff because I went to grad school at range, and I worked briefly as a range guy for the BLM. And most of my cohorts that were range guys, you know, they don't know anything about frogs or snails, and they don't even care, actually. And the point being is that there's all these impacts that they're not even aware of because they're not thinking about them. Irrigation destroys fishing. Next picture. And then that has an effect. So you have less water in the rivers, means you have less fish being produced, and that affects things like river otters or bald eagles or anything else that feeds on fish. Next picture. Here's a fence line contrast in Wyoming, just showing this is BLM land here grazed, and then the highway right away here with the grass showing what the potential is. Next shot. Here's a cow blasted area in the Escalante Grand Staircase National Monument in Utah. Next picture. And then again the Nature Conservancy's Dugout Ranch in Utah. You can see as a fine example of rangelands management here. Next picture. And when you have something like that, that's that barren, you're losing also things like food for animals like butterflies or hummingbirds or other things that depend on flowers and so forth. When you have a landscape, put that other one back for a second. If it's this cow blasted, where's the butterfly going to get his food? Where's the hummingbird going to get his food? Where's the bees going to get his food? There are over 500 species of bees found in Utah, wild species of bees. And you know, they're impacted by the cattle grazing both because a lot of them live underground. They get impacted by the trampling and compaction of soil, but they also get impacted because their food source is eliminated. Next picture. So, on public lands, wildlife forage is, and forage means the grass out there, is allotted primarily for livestock. And I made up this picture, and it's really, actually, yeah, it's a pie chart. And the pie chart is exaggerating, because really, only about that much actually is allotted to wildlife. But I wanted to, just to make the point, because if I put it that much, you wouldn't be able to tell that there was any wildlife portion at all. So here's the pie chart showing the public lands forage and how it gets a lot. Even in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which, like I said, has more elk and deer and so forth, 90% of the forage in the greater Yellowstone on the public lands goes allotted to livestock, not to elk and deer and bighorn sheep. Next picture. So here's another one of these comparison things. This has never been grazed. And this is grazed just below the butte. It's a place called Dutch Woman Butte because it has steep cliffs on the side of it in Arizona, and they've done studies. And you hear, this is another one of those things you hear all the time. There's a guy called Alan Savory, and he has a thing called holistic management, and it's very popular with a lot of ranchers and stuff. And Alan Savory says the problem is not that rangelands have been overgrazed, but they haven't been grazed enough. So it's a very popular thing with ranchers, of course. And so he'll say, all these grasslands that are not grazed are decadent and they're full of overmature grasses. And if you guys are here from Oregon, you've heard the argument about overmature trees in the forest, which we call old growth, that the foresters for years said we had to get rid of. Well, it's the same argument being used on grasslands. But again, if you're a grouse or a quail or a small rodent, which side of this fence would you want to be be living on? Next picture. And which one's going to have less erosion? This side here where there's no cows, or is this side going to erode more with more soil losses and so forth? And also, without the grasses reflect heat, so the soil here is going to be hotter, so you get more evaporation from the soil as a result than you do on this side and so forth. A lot of subtle things. Next picture. And then you get the erosion. This is in Arizona on national forest land, which is one of the biggest factors from livestock grazing is erosion. And I'll tell you why. Go ahead, next picture. Because, in particularly in arid environments, there's this thing called biocrusts, which this guy Alan Savory says is a really bad thing and we have to trample the ground to get rid of it. But these crusts hold the soil together. They're like little filaments in the soil, like a net, and sort of a root system that's underground that holds this the soil together against wind erosion, water erosion, and so forth. Plus, this biocrusts take nitrogen from the air and fixate it and put it into the soil. So they're adding to the nitrogen in the soil, they're reducing erosion, and another effect of that is they reduce the spread of weeds, because a lot of weed species have very tiny seeds. And the seeds have to get down into the soil and get the moisture real quick. Well, where there's this biocrust, they land on, a lot of them land on top of the biocrust and they can't get down through it to get down. But the perennial grasses, which are the native grasses of the West, have big seeds. So they have a little more stored energy, and even then they have trouble, but they can get through occasionally, and that's, of course, been a relationship that's been there for thousands of years. Next picture. So you get weed invasion. Livestock is the major source of distribution of weeds and creation of the disturbed sites that are ideal wild habitat. In other words, weeds tend to invade places that are disturbed, where there's bare soil or disturbed soil. So the cattle grazing, the trampling with their hooves and stuff, and breaking up the crust facilitates that. But they also get seeds on their coats, they get it in their digestive system, and since they're being moved around, they're feeding in some pasture, the rancher brings them out onto the public lands, they've been feeding on grass that might have weeds in it, the seeds get out there, and we have the weed invasion that way in a new place. So you get things like cheatgrass, which is all this, which looks good to people that don't know anything, but this cheatgrass is an annual grass with the very tiny seeds that can get down only when the biocrusts are disturbed. And because so much of this rangeland has been disturbed by livestock, there's a lot of cheatgrass in a lot of places. Next picture. Aspen loss, another thing, very important tree, because the aspen are favorite food of cattle. Where there's aspen, the older trees die, they fall down, but there's no young trees replacing them, so we get a lot of groves that look like this around the west. Next picture. And again, a degraded riparian area, as you can see there. Destruction of predators. You know, we're just getting some wolves back into Oregon, and we're going to start shooting. Well, they have already started shooting some. And they're in Montana and Idaho, Wyoming. Big controversy. They're going to kill unlimited number in Idaho. They're going to kill hundreds in Wyoming. They're going to kill hundreds in Montana. And as I said earlier, a lot of this is preventable. Next picture. And not necessary. For example, in some countries like in Europe, you're not allowed to kill predators like wolves. So what do? Well, they have shepherds, they have guard dogs, they do things like that. And guess what? They have far fewer losses. They still lose a few, but not nearly as many. But if ranchers had to do that, of course that would cost money. But they're able to externalize, as economists say. They don't have to pay that price, because we allow them to just put their cows out there for months at a time with nobody watching them. And then if a wolf happens to come along, I call it four-legged picnic baskets. If a wolf comes along and finds the picnic basket out there and eats it, then we shoot the wolf, instead of saying, like if you've ever been in Yellowstone Park or other places around there, you leave your picnic basket out at night, you get a fine from the ranger for leaving your food out because you're going to entice a bear or some other animal to eat on it. We're not allowed to do that, but ranchers, oh no problem. Leave your picnic baskets all over. Anyway, predation is an important ecological function, has a lot of effects. There was just an article by a researcher here at Oregon State University where he's collaborating with a bunch of other people where they're finding that all around the world, top predators have major ecological effects on ecosystems. And the loss of those top predators, like wolves and mountain lions, has a big effect that is not counted as one of the costs of livestock production. Next picture. And native wildlife supports other native wildlife. And the point that is, as I mentioned earlier, if we're allotting most of the grass to livestock, that means there's less for elk to eat. There's less for bison to eat, and so forth. Or we shoot the bison like they come out of Yellowstone Park. Well, if a bison dies and a wolf or coyote's feeding on it, they don't do anything. But if that were a cow, well, those are dead coyotes then, because they're not allowed to eat the cows. Next picture. Even the dead ones. So poor animal husbandry leads to predator conflicts, as I mentioned. Next picture. We just put them out there. Dead cows and boneyards introduce predators to livestock. This is one of the major effects. And there's been, again, a lot of research on this. When the cows die out there, most ranchers either leave them out there for a long time or they drag them to what they call boneyards. And like they've done some research in eastern Oregon and shown that the wolves will be attracted to those boneyards. They start feeding on cows. That's how they get introduced to beef, and then they get hooked. And then the next time they see a live cow, then they're much more likely to attack it. So you set up a situation where you're setting up this addiction, and then the consequence is you kill the predators, when it's easy to avoid the addiction in the first place by cleaning up after yourself. Just being a good neighbor. Next picture. So that leads to demands by livestock for predator slaughter. And I don't have time. I have a whole talk about predators. But the interesting thing is, the more you kill predators, the more likely you are to have conflicts. And just to tell you real quickly why, is when you have a lot of predator control, you have younger animals that tend to be less experienced as hunters. And if you're less experienced as hunters, what's an easier thing to take? An elk or a deer? Or a cow or a sheep. And so when they do a lot of predator control, they skew the population to younger animals that are therefore more likely to kill livestock, which in turn then says, well, the solution is we obviously got to kill more of the predators, which only exacerbates the whole situation, and you have this self-feeding mechanism back that fulfills itself by that, which is why they've been killing coyotes for 100 years, and we still have to kill coyotes because it never seems like we kill enough of them. Next picture. And mountain lions is the same thing. There was a study just done in Washington State where they showed that as the number of complaints, they had all these mountain lions radio collared. As the number of mountain lions were going down because they were increasing the hunting of them, trying to reduce the conflicts, As the mountain lion population went down, the number of complaints went up. And again, without getting into all the social nuances and so forth, you know, you can have a mountain lion living in an area with a lot of livestock that doesn't attack livestock necessarily. But then you go and kill that one, you open up that spot, here comes another, maybe a younger animal, and we know, I got teenagers. What are teenagers? They're bold and they're reckless, they're not very experienced, you know, and that's what you get, a lot of teenagers out there. Well, that's the worst thing in the world. So that's what we do by predator control. Next picture. So 95% of all wolf mortality is human-caused, primarily in retaliation for livestock. This is a figure for Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And it'll soon be the figure here for Oregon. Next picture. And then I talked about the prairie dogs. I'm just going to go on beyond that. We talked about them getting killed. Then another cause is disease transmission. Bighorn sheep get diseases from domestic sheep. So where you have a lot of domestic sheep, the diseases get transmitted to the bighorns. The bighorns die. And in Montana, they decided to try to alleviate that. What they do is they go out and shoot the bighorns. So if the bighorns get too close to the domestic sheep on our public land, they go out and shoot the bighorns, the wild sheep that are supposed to be living there, to protect the domestic sheep, because otherwise they might have to move the domestic sheep away from the wild bighorns. That's Montana's policy. And so this is another cost of livestock production. Next picture. And there's lots of other diseases they transmit too. Social displacement. This is a real subtle thing, but there's a number of studies that show that when you bring in the cattle onto an area, animals like elk leave. They just don't want to be in the same neighborhood. You know, the neighborhood goes downhill and they just want to move out, you know. So the elk are displaced, but they, you know, if you assume that they're in that place in the first place because it's good habitat, if they're displaced someplace else, they're going to something that's not quite as good. So, and this is being repeated all over the West. Next picture.
Did you say that the wild ones are getting sick from the...
Yeah, they get a disease from the domestic sheep.
But they go out and shoot the wild...
They shoot the wild ones because they don't want them, if they start getting too close to the domestic sheep, rather than move the domestic sheep, they kill the wild bighorns to keep them from getting too close to the domestic sheep where they might get the disease. Or if they already got the disease, they shoot them right away, hoping that they won't spread it to the rest of the bighorn sheep herd. Here's the Nature Conservancy's Saigon Ranch operation in eastern Oregon. And when you get it overgrazed, it eliminates grasses, reduces competition for water and bare soil, which promotes pine invasion. This is another cost. Next picture. So we have all around the West, all this stuff where we're talking about they call it overstocked pine forests, and then they say now we have no choice but to go in and log those forests because now we have too many pine trees. But, next picture, a lot of that invasion is due to grazing. Because here's a place that's never been grazed. When the grass is heavy like this, the pine seedlings can't get down to the ground. It's kind of the same thing as the biocrust. The grass outcompetes the pine seedlings, so you get an open pine forest without that heavy stocking. So what do? They say we got to go in and do thinning of the forest, like they want to do on the east side, to quote, prevent wildfires and reduce the fuel loading, but they still keep on grazing, which is one of the factors that leads to that. So we have a self-fulfilling and self-ever-perpetuating thing where we're going to go in and log the forest, which also spreads weeds and has other impacts. We're going to log the forest, and then we're going to keep on grazing, so then we get more invasion of pines, and then we'll have another reason to have to go and log, and it works really good for the timber industry to kind of perpetuate itself that way. And but they won't do the thing that would, you know, it's treating the symptoms rather than the causes. Next picture. Livestock is only one of the causes, but it is one of the causes. So we have this kind of thinning stuff advocated as a way to cure this problem, but you never get rid of the cause. Next picture. And meanwhile, the grazing continues in forested areas. Next picture. And that impacts and alters fire regimes. Next picture. In various ways. It makes them sometimes worse, sometimes less worse. And then fences are a big problem. You got fences all around the West. You got all these cattle out there. You got fences, and fences are bad for wildlife. Hawks and eagles and stuff will sit on the fence posts, and they feed on sage grouse. Sage grouse are being candidates for endangered species status, and one of the reasons is because all the fence posts. Also, sage grouse are poor flyers, and they have a really high percentage of them just fly into fences because they're not very good at flying. So fences have another impact out there. It's one of the costs of livestock. Next picture. So sage-grouse. Next picture. And thousands of Yellowstone bison are shot to appease the livestock industry. This has to do with the disease thing, brucellosis, which some bison have, and which they originally got from livestock, by the way. And the ranchers in Montana are afraid that their cattle will get brucellosis from the bison. Again, it's a very complicated thing, but bison bull, the only way you can get brucellosis, if they could, is if a cow comes and licks an aborted fetus that has the active bacteria, brucellosis bacteria, that has not died. Okay? And bacteria are very sensitive to heat and dehydration and so forth. So you have to have all these circumstances, and that cow has to be a cow that hasn't been vaccinated, because they're not required to vaccinate against brucellosis, even though they could. It has to be a cow that hasn't been vaccinated, licks that aborted fetus. All right, but a bull can't transmit it because they can't abort fetuses. Calves can't transmit brucellosis because they can't abort fetuses. But they shoot bison bulls and calves. In fact, they get more bison bulls and calves coming out of Yellowstone than they get cows. So they shoot any bison that comes out. So is this about brucellosis? I don't think so. The reason is if bison were to get well established on the public lands outside of Yellowstone Park, well, they eat the same thing as the cows. So you're going to have this push comes to shove, and the public says, well, you know, I'd rather have my bison out there than have your cows. The ranchers are afraid that's what's going to happen. So that's why they're using this brucellosis as this excuse to try to contain and bottleneck up bison in Yellowstone Park and keep them off the rest of the public land. Next picture. Another cost of livestock grazing. Prairie dogs, critical to 50 other species. I talked briefly about that already. I'm going to keep moving. Another impact. When you have all these grazing impacts, if you go and look at the budgets, like this is a cottonwood tree in a place called the Gila Box Riparian Conservation Area. And the cows were eating all the young cottonwood trees. I mentioned the historic cottonwoods, just the big ones left. So they were trying to establish young cottonwoods again. So they put in this drip irrigation and fenced all the cottonwoods to keep the cows from eating it. So who paid for that? You would think, since it's the cows that are causing it, the ranchers should pay for that. Well, think again. It came out of the wildlife funds because, you know, cottonwood are important for wildlife. So it has to. So our tax dollars are going to mitigate the impact of somebody's private livestock on our public lands, and we pay for it. The same thing when you go into campgrounds and they're fenced. You bet, and you check that, it'll come out of the recreation budget, not out of the range budget. Next picture. Another cost. Range improvements, like putting in the water. Next picture. Cattle guards. All this comes with tax dollars. Ranchers pay little or no money for this. Another cost of livestock production. On public or private lands, like in the county I live in, Montana, all the taxpayers are charged to put in cattle guards on the roads to keep the cattle from, you know, wandering where they're not supposed to go. But the ranchers don't pay for that. We pay for it all. Why should I have to pay for that? It's his business. It's an externalization of the cost. Next picture. So, livestock and global warming. This will get back to our food thing. Livestock sector is a major player in climate change, responsible for 18%, 1/5 of greenhouse gases emission measured in CO2 equivalents, according to the United States Livestock Long Shadow report. Next picture. So, effects of meat eating on CO2. A University of Chicago study calculated that if Americans were to reduce meat consumption by just 20%, it would be as if we all switched from a standard sedan to a ultra-efficient Prius. Just 20%. You don't even have to go totally, you know, vegetarian or anything like that. So imagine if you are all vegetarian, you could drive 5 SUVs and still feel good about it. Next picture. Okay. Why grass-fed beef is worse than CAFOs. See, this is another thing you hear, because they're still trying to promote it. You hear all this stuff about, oh, it's grass-fed beef, it's okay. Well, the fact is actually grass-fed beef produces more greenhouse gases than the confined animal feeding, because grass is very rough forage, and it has to stay in the rumen longer, and the rumen bacteria is what emits the greenhouse gases. So it takes longer to digest it, so ultimately you actually produce more greenhouse gases eating an all grass diet than if you fed them in a feedlot. I'm not saying the feedlot things are good by any means, but grass-fed beef isn't good either. Basically, I come to the conclusion, no beef is any good. So that's the next picture. Let's go to the next one.
CAFOs mean, CAFOs.
Huh?
Acronym.
Oh, confined animal feeding operations. That's what CAFO stands for. Okay. Local versus local feed versus meat and dairy. This is another one of the popular things. Last year, a study by the Carnegie Mellon University concluded that production counts more than food miles for carbon output, meaning exempting red meat and diet from dairy from one's diet just one day a week did more to lower one's carbon footprint than eating local every day of the week. So that's another one of those things that's, you know, favors.
Do you think that if they can only like do one thing and they're not going to eliminate it completely, that it would be better to have like some grass-fed meat and get rid of all those commercial farming than
Well, yes and no. I actually contributed to a book called CAFO, and I wrote a chapter about the impacts of livestock on that. And the confined animal things, if you were to look at the total ecological footprint of, you know, because one, you have to have the cows over a much larger area, so they're out there trampling, repairing areas. If you figure that cost in, you're having the impacts on all the wildlife along streams. You got the water pollution that's going on. You know, the confined animal places, at least the bigger ones, all have sewage treatment for the manure and stuff, or at least more and more they have to do that. It would be questionable whether it's really better.
Well, I'm saying if you had people eat less meat as opposed to telling them to eliminate it completely, because there's also an impact on people's health from eating those commercially raised.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, if I were going to say what meat, I would say eat something like chicken is probably better, even though that's bad too because of the CAFOs. But the pounds, if you look at the amount, you know, just for the, it's so inefficient to get every pound of beef. You have all these other impacts that are much bigger. You know, that's my viewpoint on it anyway.
Yeah, can we go back for a minute? One slide,
Yeah.
the asterisk there.
Yeah.
That's a great point, because to vegans and vegetarians like us, people often say, "Oh, well, it's so natural. They could just graze on the land. It can be grass-fed, and that's the way it used to be." But as you point out there isn't nearly enough of that.
Well, that's the other problem. Yeah, there isn't enough. It's sort of like at one point or another, you come down to the point that there isn't enough of it. It's sort of the same argument I would make about fossil fuels. You know, we're going to run out of oil and gas sooner or later, and you know, they're not making it anymore. They're not making more land. All the land that can be used is being used for agriculture already. So if you were to eliminate and say we're going to make it all grass-fed, then you're going to have probably try to expand in a lot more places that shouldn't, you know, like tropical rainforests and stuff that shouldn't be expanded. So next picture.
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is we don't need to eat meat to stay healthy.
Right, right. So eat less meat, eat more fruits and vegetables, which is what the you know, all the medical research suggests. Next picture. And you know, if you want to, you know, get your food, you're better off too with local gardens and that kind of stuff growing. You know, here's another statistic. I read somewhere that there's 40 million acres in the United States in lawn. Now, I mentioned before that in California they grow half of the vegetables and fruits in the country on about 3, maybe 4 million acres. So that suggests to me that if we had a whole lot more lawns going into gardens, we could actually probably feed most of this country just in cities. Well, you know, you don't even need Iowa to do it. So the potential, you know, there's all these things that, you know, we make assumptions about stuff that may not be correct. And I'm just throwing that out. You know, not everybody wants to have their lawn into a garden or has the time to do their garden or whatever. But the point is there's a lot of land that's already impacted, in my view. You know, the city areas are impacted. Might as well put that to good use instead of just growing on Kentucky bluegrass out there that you got to mow every week anyway. So, next picture.
I was going to say something too. Coming from Colorado,
Yeah.
You're not allowed to do any kind of rain catchment, well, for when it does eventually rain. And you're not allowed to use your gray water, even if you're using eco-friendly products, to do any kind of food production. The minute it hits the ground, it's property of Denver Water. So you cannot do any kind of water catchment.
Let's skip this picture for a second. Okay, go on. Go on. Go on. Yeah, go on. Okay. So part of this is this whole cowboy culture. You know, it's bravado and so forth that it's being perpetuated. You know, I don't see it as a very good culture to perpetuate, you know, and you hear all this stuff, oh, we're going to keep our traditional lifestyles and so forth. What is it? It's a kind of a brutal lifestyle. Look at what they do to cattle and stuff. You know, they're sticking them with, I just think about these hot branding irons going on them and all the other stuff that they're doing. It's just not a good way to be. I mean, it's just not, it's violence. Next picture. We'll skip this one too. Okay, I just want to. I'm gonna probably end it right here because we're getting too long-winded here. But I just wanted to talk again about this savory guy, and this is on a ranch that practices the savory game. And this guy, and in all honesty, is telling me that this side of the fence is better than this side of the fence. Because see, we got this old, mature, decadent grass over here, and here we have the grass that's been cropped. And this is one of the deceptions. Again, unless you're really versed in sort of science of this stuff, you can get easily deceived, because there will be studies that will show that if you measure how much forage production is on the grazed area, if you graze it and leave it alone for a while, you'll get new grass growing here. So you go out there, and the way the scientists would do is they clip the grass and then they weigh that, and they weigh the grass production on this side. You're going to get more pounds per acre on this side because of the Mayday effect I was talking about. It's going to translocate thing. But they're not measuring the roots oftentimes. And so if you were to measure the whole root and the top of the plant, you would find that you're getting overall less production. But you can, in all honesty and in truthfulness, say that this side will produce more forage if it's done in a certain way. But is more forage the only important thing? That's the other thing. You know, again, wildlife is important, and that's not necessarily done well by that. So, and range situations, the way rangelands are evaluated, they rate them excellent, good, fair, poor condition, and so forth. And what they do is they take a place that isn't grazed, and they say what grasses would normally be growing there, and then they compare what you find on the grazed area. And so if the grasses are similar on the grazed area to the non-grazed area, then that will be rated as good or excellent range. But it could be this short. So it may be, all the grasses here may be the same grasses on this side, but again, if you're wildlife trying to hide, even good or excellent range condition isn't necessarily good for wildlife. So there's a lot of ways that whole system is skewed, because of course it was invented by the livestock industry for its own use. But if you're not aware of how these things are done, you can get misled. So I'm just going to end it right there and not go any further. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, in the back.
What is the per capita consumption of meat by the meat lover, and how do we get there?
What is the what per capita meat consumption? I don't know offhand in the United States.
If we can get them to reduce it, and maybe the impact may not be as strong, because we cannot get everybody to change to be us. So only we can change ourselves.
Well, let me respond just something they made me think of from that. The western rangelands, which are really arid, they're not as productive as places further east. So you can grow far, if you wanted to grow cows, you're much better off growing cows in some place like Florida or Georgia or Missouri than you are in some place like Nevada. So for example, in fact I have a statistic on that, Vermont, which is not a very big state, has more beef produced in Vermont than all of Nevada, which is about 10 times bigger. In fact, it's more than that. It's like 12 or 13 times bigger than Vermont. But that's because it rains in Vermont. And it doesn't rain much in Nevada. So all these arid landscapes, particularly in the west, are not very productive. So just if there were a reduction, even a small reduction in meat consumption, we could eliminate cows from millions, hundreds of millions of acres, which are ecologically fragile, and reduce some of the impacts, in fact, much more significant, because as I mentioned, like wildlife in the west that depend on these riparian areas, 70–80%, well, you don't have nearly that percentage in the east because it's moist everywhere. So if you were going to grow cows, then someplace like Pennsylvania or Missouri makes more sense, where it rains. And in fact, that's where the most of the beef is produced anyway. Yeah.
Why don't the ranchers in the West just ranch bison, since that's the natural?
Yeah. Well, that's a I'll give you two responses. One response is, if you were to treat bison like cows and fence them in and all that, they'd start having some of the same impacts that cows do, because they're, they normally want to wander more. If you confine them and stuff, they're going to start. I still think they would be better. They wouldn't be as vulnerable to predators and so forth. So maybe you wouldn't kill as many coyotes or wolves. So yes, it would be better. But the main reason, because this has been proposed many times, is we're cowboys. We're not bison boys.
You can't ride a bison.
Well, no, it's a whole cultural, traditional thing that really dominates, and that's been the reaction. Is we won't do that because we're, that's not what we do. And it means
commercial viability as well.
There is some of that, but they get higher prices for bison than they do for regular cattle. And the bison are hardier. They don't take as much care in the wintertime, like in northern climates like Montana and so forth. So there are a fair number of advantages, but it hasn't been adopted widely. There are some, but not many. In the back.
To show it's outrageous that we've sold our future, our land and our children to a bunch of profit-making people. So where's the accountability in this? How can they be ruining the water and the land like this and keep on doing it and have nobody to answer to?
Well, my response will be somewhat nuanced in several ways, but one is most people aren't aware of it. Like the streams of the riparian areas I showed you, where most people would say that's a nice looking trout stream, so you drive by it and you just don't notice the damage. That's one problem. You don't see the CO2 going in the air from the emissions from the bacteria in the rumen. There's a lot of reasons why a lot of this is invisible. The second reason is there's a tremendous amount of political power that agriculture in general has, but particularly ranchers in western states have. Like if you go to the state of Montana, where I'm living right now, I did an analysis when I was in grad school. I looked at Montana and then I looked at some other western states and the same pattern fell. But at the time I did it in Montana, which was about 15 years ago, 77% of the county commissioners were ranchers. 56% of the legislature was ranchers. The governor, the lieutenant governor were ranchers. The senators and the congressmen were ranchers. And so my next question, and they make up like 1% of Montana's population. So I'm like, how come that happens? Well, there's some things that are said. Like the Montana legislature meets in the wintertime. Well, who has a lot of free time in the winter? That they can leave their job for 3 or 4 months. Well, in the wintertime in Montana, all you're doing is throwing out some hay to the cows. That's it, until calving season in March. So you can be a legislator easily. And the whole tradition is county commissioners tend to be the stepping stone to becoming a state legislature, that then becomes a stepping stone to becoming a congressman or senator. So it's a whole rigged system. The large landowners, they have name recognition. They've often been there a long time. So, they decide to run for county commission. The county commissioners control things like putting in those cattle guards and stuff like that. So they have a self-interest in becoming county commissioners because they can take the public money and say we're going to put in cattle guards, or we're going to spray herbicides and for weeds, we're going to do this and that. So they have a real incentive to run for those positions, and then they get their way up through the political system. So that's part of the reason, is that there's a real dominance by that culture in a lot of the western landscape. And it's really, right now in Montana, we have Senator Malskbakis, whose father owns the biggest sheep ranch in Montana. We have John Tester. He's a farmer, but he's still he's part of agriculture, so he's sympathetic to that. We have Dennis Rehberg, who calls himself a rancher, but he's actually a subdivider. But he comes from a ranching family that's subdividing land. So that's our representation there. Our governor, Brian Schweitzer, is a rancher. And I don't know the occupation of the lieutenant governor. Do you know, Mary? He's a businessman. Yeah, businessman. Oh, we got one out of them that isn't. So, but you see what the point is. It's very difficult when you have that kind of political persuasion of the elected officials to to change these rules and laws. So.
The food system is rigged to the powerful.
Yeah, it is, and they're powerful. And they control a lot of land in states like Montana and so forth. You're a big landowner, so that gives you clout, because people think there's a whole assumption. I mean, this is part of our society going back to kings and queens and stuff, you know. It's like if you own a lot of land, you must be a smart person because, you know, smart people own a lot of land. I mean, that's sort of the logic behind it. So therefore, we'll elect you into office and so forth. Yeah.
I got a question for you. Because I was actually surprised to see the Nature Conservancy slides.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd read some of their stuff, I hadn't really realized that. I think Oregon Environmental Council also does a whole lot of things with ranchers out here. It just strikes me as funny why the environmental community is doing that. If you have any thoughts on
well, I think there's a couple of things. One, like I said, even in the Nature Conservancy, a lot of people don't know these impacts. They're not aware. And then there's a self-selection. The people that do see the impacts don't last in the organization. I don't want to go into a whole lot of details, but I had one friend, for example, who works for the Nature Conservancy, and his job was to certify, you know, which land should be, you know, protected and so forth, and he refused to sign his name on these things, and he got punched out by the state director, and, you know, and he left and stuff. So there's a whole culture that selects for people that agree with the idea that the cows are better than the condos, and the condos is the assumption is if you got rid of all these cows, suddenly the whole West is going to be covered with houses. But you know, it's an absurd thing because people want to live where there's amenities. That's why we congregate in cities. I just drove over to North Dakota. You know, most of North Dakota is private, and the land is relatively speaking cheap. And how many of you people want to move to North Dakota right now? Raise your hand.
Well, and you can't build condos on BLM.
Well, that's the other thing. Public lands won't happen at all. Exactly. So that's the other point. But even on the private lands, most of the development is near bigger urban areas, and then you can have. And then my response to them is, why don't you do what Oregon does, which is you have land use zoning and you have urban growth boundaries, and then you don't have that issue at all. But the fact is that even if you don't have urban growth boundaries, you'll see most of that, like I tried to show you in the picture of Montana, it's concentrated around most of the larger cities. And yeah, there's a lot of subdivisions around there, and that's because people need jobs, they need hospitals, they need schools and so forth, and they don't want to live out in eastern Montana where you can drive 100 miles to the next little town where the only thing you'll find is a bar, maybe two, and that's it. So, you've had your hand up for a while. Yeah.
I'm a social worker, and the National Association of Social Workers has now developed a policy saying that we need to support sustainability. And you know, there's lots of examples that, you know, like the recycling centers create jobs and help landlords and prevent environmental degradation and so forth. But one thing I'm seeing as a social worker is, you know, there's a lot of impact on people in terms of, you know, the disease, health issues, the environment with CO2 and so forth. I mean, just a multiple of issues. My question is, okay, say you have money, 10,000 to buy 10,000 acres, which for some ranchers that's not a big range. Is there something you could do with that that would make it economically feasible to replace a ranch with something else? Is there,
you know, it depends upon where you are and what other amenities might possibly be there and how badly you degraded your present situation. For example, I had the picture of the trout there, and I calculated that for every acre of water that was used for irrigation and how many pounds of beef that produced, you could produce, if you left it in the river, X amount more pounds of trout, which were worth way more per pound, particularly for people who come sport fishing to catch the trout, you know, maybe release them or whatever, then if you, and the wildlife it supported and so forth, then taking that water out of the stream to grow cow food. So it would depend upon your circumstances and where you were. But, you know, a lot of that stuff is, it's just not economical in the long run. I'm going to tell you another story. I was with a rancher, this partly I'm going to answer sort of long-winded again, but I was with a rancher in Montana who was saying that ranching was a sustainable industry. And he was given a tour of his ranch. And I'm going to tell you some vignettes. This happened over the course of the whole day. And I'm going to make it sound like it happened, you know, like all within a half an hour. But we were overlooking this one valley. He says, yeah, when I was a kid, there were 6 families down there. And we used to get together every Tuesday night for dinner. You know, all the families get together and so forth. But, you know, they gradually went broke. And my my granddad and then my dad bought up the ranches, you know. Okay, so then we go on a little further, and he's telling me about how when he was a kid, he used to go 3 miles to the school down the road. But now his kids on the ranch have to take an hour-and-a-half bus ride to get to the nearest town because, well, the 6 ranch families that are no longer there don't have the kids, and the same thing in the next valley and the next valley. So now the school had to be closed locally, and they have to write this on. He says, and my kids can't be on basketball team and all this stuff. And then he said, yeah, well, now we don't have a vet here. I got to go all the way into Great Falls to get somebody to treat, you know, the animals and stuff because they won't come out here because, again, there's not enough ranches left to support the vet anymore. And he says, and my wife, she hates being out here because she doesn't have anybody to talk to anymore, and she wants to go live in Great Falls, and you know, we're probably going to do that, and you know, because she didn't. So the whole thing is socially disintegrating. So it's not sustainable, and this is with all the ecological damage being done. And then I happened to run into this guy about 5 or 6 years later, and I asked him, so how are things going? You know, well, his wife did move into Great Falls so the kids could go to high school there and be in sports and stuff. And she met some other guy, and he was out on the ranch, and they got divorced. And now he's still saying it's a sustainable thing, you know. And I am, you know, this is a great industry. And he finally had to sell the ranch. He sold it to Boone and Crockett Club or somebody because it wasn't making money anymore, even with the 6 other ranches part of it. And now he's the ranch manager. So that was a whole, from being the ranch owner to the ranch manager to having his whole family disintegrate. That is a metaphor for what's happening all around in the rural parts of the West. So it's not sustainable. It's just taking a long, long time to die out. And because it doesn't disappear overnight, people think it's sustainable, but it's not.
I have a very short one.
Yeah.
Please give me a break. You know, you showed some areas that are protected, vis-a-vis others that are not protected. So how did we get to the point of getting that protection? The question is, how can we get, you know, the other areas protected?
Well, there's 2 answers. One, some of the places I showed you are self-protected, like I was saying, there's cliffs around it, and so they just couldn't get cows there, or maybe there wasn't any source of water. The other is eliminating grazing can happen several ways. These are on public lands anyway. It's all discretionary. We can say to any rancher, we don't want your cows out there anymore, and they can close it, what's called the allotment. But that almost never happens. So the way to try to get that to happen that's been proven somewhat successful, and it's kind of some people don't like it because they feel like they should have to do this, but what they've done in places, Steens Mountain in Oregon is a good example. They said to some of the ranchers out there, we want to get rid of cows on this place, and we're going to give you money to not graze here anymore. Even though it's sort of like if I were renting a house and I had a long-term tenant in there and I wanted to get them out, sometimes it's easier just to give them $1,000 to move out than to try to go through the whole eviction, you know, process and so forth. So that's what they're doing. They call it public lands buyout, cattle allotment buyouts, and the way it's usually happening is with some other legislation, like Steens Mountain was made into a national conservation area. With that legislation was this buyout of cattle permits. The same thing has happened in quite a number of other areas around the West. Small though, because still most of the West is grazed, but there have been about 500,000 acres around Yellowstone where ranchers have been presented with money to give up grazing, and they sign a thing and say, we're not going to graze this land again, and the Forest Service or whoever is the administrator of it says, we're going to close the allotment and never allow grazing here again. So right now it seems to be bribery. Works. Yeah. Yes.
Why is agriculture exempt included on that?
You know, because it's considered essential. You know, it's one of those things they're saying, you know, it's essential. We all need food. That's the logic. So, yeah. How about you in the back?
Comment that cattle originally too were just beasts of burden. We didn't eat them. We didn't eat them to the rate that we do now. I mean, same with goats. When we did agriculture, it was to grow food, not to eat animals.
Right. Or they plowed the land and so forth. Yeah. Right.
So, who are you speaking to? Are you affecting change, and how can we help?
Well, you know, I try to educate people. It's surprising how difficult it is to get invitations actually to talk on this subject, particularly in more pro-ranching states like Montana. A lot of the environmental groups that you would not, that I was mentioning the Nature Conservancy here, but there's a lot of other groups that don't want me to come talk to them because they don't want to hear what I got to say. And but, you know, I try to get the word out to the degree that I can. I did a big book called Welfare Ranching. That was one thing with lots and lots of pictures, of which some of these are from that book. That came out, about 7 or 8 years ago. And then just continue to harp away at it. To tell you the truth, I think what is going to eliminate a lot of cattle grazing, at least in the arid West, is just the economics. It is, like I described with this one rancher, it is a downhill thing, partly because expectations are changed too. When his grandfather homesteaded that particular ranch, they lived in a log cabin, they had horses. Now he's got a big pickup truck to support, he wants to send his kids to college, and he's got the same land base. And that land base hasn't gotten any more productive. In fact, it's gotten degraded and gone downhill. So you're trying to support a much larger, more expensive lifestyle on the same land base that's been degraded and is not as productive. And so a lot of them are running into the economic thing. And what you see is a lot of people don't want to go into that. A very common thing you'll see in those rural areas is that the kids go off to college or whatever, and then they don't come back. You know, they want to live in Portland or something. You know, they may have fond memories of the life growing up on the ranch and so forth, but it's not the lifestyle that they want to continue. So there's this attrition happening all over, and I think over time that's going to happen. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, there's all these animals that are endangered largely because of livestock. It's one of the major contributing factors, and some of them aren't going to be around by the time all out of this ranching's gone, which is unfortunate.